Welcome to another edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective, a Utah Jazz podcast giving you an Upper Bowl point of view with courtside quality, joined as always by my co-hosts Kyler and Landon. And we are now a couple days removed from the sixth official rebrand since the Jazz moved from New Orleans to Salt Lake City back in the 1970s. And if you look at Kyler's screen, you can see he has the four different jerseys up for us to peruse. And it's definitely been a pretty massive rebrand. We're seeing a lot of changes than what we're used to in the past. And Kyler, Landon, after looking at the new jerseys where they're bringing back the Purple Mountain, which was huge back a couple years ago as one of the alternate jerseys for the Jazz, and then this combination of white, black, and yellow, what comes to mind for you?
My first thought is I now am 100% certain that I want to trade Donovan Mitchell because I never want him to have to wear that. That is incredibly ugly. I think, the saying, look good, feel good, you play good. And so I think the second he dons that uniform, his trade value goes down because of that, because he will not look good. So, that's my initial thought on the Jazz. But I do like the Purple Mountain.
Yeah. So the Jazz have taken some pretty hard L's throughout their history. 97, 98 finals come to mind, blowing a 3-1 deficit to the Denver in 2020. This is up there. It was one of the hardest L's the Utah Jazz have ever taken, in my opinion. I don't like those yellow and white jerseys at all. Not a fan. I think they're hard to look at. I thought maybe, they would look good on the players, but after seeing Clarkson model them, I still don't think they look good. It'll be interesting to see what they do with them going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the Jazz have definitely had a bit of a rough past at times when it comes to some of the jerseys they put out onto the court. I think we all remember last year when we saw those terrible green and a similar yellow jerseys that we saw last year that just looked like we were sponsored by Subway. Every time someone would make a three for like 2 games, we were just like, eat fresh, because the jerseys just look so bad. And these ones might be even worse. When I saw the jerseys personally, my first thought was, I can now understand why Rudy Gobert dyed his hair such an awful yellow color. It's because he's trying to match the jerseys. And the second thought I had was, we look like we are sponsored by like some sort of office supply company, because that's just like a terrible highlighter yellow color. And from all my friends I've talked to, from what I've seen on social media, it seems like everybody hates the black, the yellow, and the white jerseys for the most part. But without focusing too much on the negative of how bad those jerseys are, what do you guys think about bringing back the Purple Mountain jerseys?
I mean, for me, I think it's a good move, first off. And I think it's also the Jazz's favorite jersey, because despite a whole new color palette that they introduced, the rebranding, everything that they were saying about it is, hey, purple is back and here to stay. That was, the phrase that rolled along with this new rebrand. And so not only does everyone on social media seem to think it's the best move they made in this rebrand, but I also think the Jazz organization seems to think it's the best jersey that they rolled out.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a savvy level of damage control by bringing those back out. Purple jerseys are great, and they've aged like fine wine. I think they hold up today as well as they did when they were introduced in the 90s. So good move. It'd be nice to see those back for sure. If we go back to the black and yellow real quick, though, I want to read this little excerpt from the press release they dropped, because I found it personally funny as far as the reasoning as to why they went with these colors. It said, the white and black uniforms symbolize the white and black keys on a piano, a key figure in the history of jazz music. The yellow jersey represents the spotlight designated to the greatest performers in history. A nod to the fact that Utah embraces being in the spotlight with all eyes watching. So I don't know.
So many eyes watching Utah all the time, It's such a big market, as they always say.
We are the most famous state, as everybody knows.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's nice to know that the Utah Jazz design team in charge of this rebrand, that they had a purpose in what they were trying to do with those jerseys. I mean, it's nice to know that at least we hired some people that at least had some thoughts in terms of what they were trying to do here. I think we can all agree that the execution was not the greatest job that they have ever done, but at least we get to see some more of the Purple Mountain jerseys, which would be a ton of fun. Were you guys also able to see the rumored new City Edition jerseys that they brought out that kind of pull on and are connected with those Purple Mountain jerseys?
Yeah, for 2023.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think those are my favorite jerseys that they introduced out of any of them. I kind of like that direction. I hope that's a direction that they go in the future.
I don't love like the all purple mountain one, but the one on the right that was kind of an homage to the last purple one, just kind of the classic without the mountains. I think that's always been a clean look. That's the most recent Jazz jersey I have is the Jay Crowder in that purple. So it's obvious that going forward, they're going to heavily include purple, which is the right move for me in my eyes.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So just to finish up this segment, nobody likes the white, the yellow, the black. We're into the Purple Mountain, but they're also, even over the past couple of days, there's been a lot of talk over social media and just different thoughts that these remix jerseys, which are the yellow, black, and white ones, they're probably only going to be here for a season or two. They're not going to be a long-term solution to the Jazz's rebrand, but they're more just going to be for this upcoming season. If the Jazz do decide to stick more with the purple, what are some other things you'd like to see done with their jerseys and with their rebrand that kind of takes away that terrible yellow color and really focuses more on the purple?
I mean, I think Lennon said that like these Purple Mountain jerseys, they hold up even though they were, introduced back in the 90s. And I think that's true, but they can still be modernized, just maybe slightly just simpler versions of it, because that's kind of obviously that's what they're going for here with this simplistic look on their other three. So just maybe modernizing it, simplifying it, and then just making it their color, because I know that was one of the big things that Ryan Smith was kind of the big reasoning behind it, is because people didn't know what the Jazz colors were, and so he decided to make them black and white is what he wanted them to be until they got rejected, and then they added the yellow because the NBA required them to. And so yeah, just modernizing it and making it the color, and maybe just kind of ditching the yellow. That is a terrible yellow.
Yeah. I agree. I think a simplistic type of, more modernized type of rendition of this jersey would be cool, which looked like, it's kind of the direction they're going with those jerseys we're going to see next season. I personally love the idea of incorporating like Southern Utah and that kind of, red, black, orange type of palette to the Jazz. I would love to see that come back in addition to the purple. I think you could maybe do something where you have, like half your jerseys be something like the Purple Mountain style, then another half be kind of, the gradient style that we've seen for the last couple of years, just kind of representing, northern Southern Utah, and kind of help reflect, what makes Utah cool and unique to the people who live here.
Yeah, it is sad to see dark mode go. That was my favorite jersey that they've introduced in a very long time.
Yeah, they were good.
Yeah. I think it's sad that when you do a rebrand, the only thing people love about the rebrand is that we went back to a design that was popular 30 years ago. And I love the Purple Mountain jerseys just as much as the next guy. I think they're fantastic. I love that they brought them back. But I'm excited to see what they can do as we look to the 2023 jerseys with the more modern Purple Mountain jerseys. I think it's going to be cool to see how we can use a little bit more of a simplistic style along with more grayscale colors. I'd love to see if they could bring in some sort of even like metallic silver. I think could be a cool accent to jerseys like that in a more modern sense. But it's great to see that those jerseys have aged really well. I'm excited to see the Utah Jazz back in them this season. But I think you, me, and the rest of the Jazz Nation are just waiting and hoping that those remix jerseys are going to be short-lived in Utah, and we will have better things to watch in upcoming seasons. Any last thoughts on the rebrand?
Yeah, I have one more. Like, everyone's talking about how bad the color scheme are, and I agree, but that is not my least favorite part about these jerseys. Look at how massive the Utah and the numbers are like, it is okay to have empty space on your jersey. Every other team has empty space on their jersey for a reason. Like, because it looks horrible to have the entirety of your torso and stomach covered by the words and the numbers. Just like it, that's my least favorite part. As much as I don't like the yellow, just like how they chose to make everything so massive and like, that's almost why I almost prefer the white, just because there's the most blank space in it. But that's just my least favorite part, even more so than the colors, is how they didn't leave any blank space.
Yeah, I agree with that. My last thought is, I feel like with the Jazz, there's always this kind of unique problem that they have, because if you were to draw a Venn diagram of the state of Utah and jazz music, there's no intersecting space there. So you got to go one on the other,
Two
right?
floating circles, yeah.
And that makes whatever you try to brand awkward, right? Because you have to like forsake one of those for the other. So I mean, I think this is hopefully an opportunity to kind of, rethink this, see how they can kind of mesh those. I'm excited to see what they can come up with. Hopefully they can find a way to mesh those in a way that fits and looks organic.
Yeah. I was talking to one of our good friends, Josh, who watches a lot of Jazz games with us, and I asked him about the jersey rebrand, and he said, "Are the Jazz moving to the Adriatic League?" And I just started to laugh, because when you look at these jerseys with the massive name, with the massive numbers, with the very simplistic style, they do look very like Northern European League jerseys, not at all like the modern NBA jerseys that we're used to. Which, once again,
jerseys, if you ask me, that's what they look like.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're like maybe one step above like a YMCA rec league team. Like, they're not great. But as much as we don't love the rebrand, one thing we do love is the Jazz, and thinking about how they are going to grow and change their roster in the upcoming season. This wraps it up for part 1, but we will be back shortly with part 2, where we're going to dive into some more trade rumors, specifically surrounding Rudy Gobert, as it looks like that's becoming more and more of an inevitability. So get ready. We'll be right back after this break to talk some Jazz trades. See you in a minute. Welcome to today's edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective, back for part 2. In part 1, we talked more about the Jazz rebrand, how much we are so excited about the remixed jerseys. But now we get to dive into something a little more fun to talk about, which is who the Jazz may find in those jerseys at the start of the season and going forward. A lot of the rumors the past couple weeks are that the Jazz are more likely to trade Rudy Gobert over Donovan Mitchell, and that they're currently not entertaining trade offers for Donovan. And as we get closer and closer to draft night, it seems like it's becoming increasingly more likely that Rudy Gobert will be traded either on draft night or shortly before. And there are 3 main teams that are rumored to be linked to the Utah Jazz with Rudy Gobert. And we're going to break down different trade scenarios with all 3 of those teams. And those are the Atlanta Hawks, the Toronto Raptors, and the Chicago Bulls. Starting off with the Atlanta Hawks, this is the one we've heard the most trade rumors on. As early as Thursday, it was reported that a deal was almost done, and the deal looks something like this. The Jazz would send Rudy Gobert to Atlanta in exchange for 2 of the following players: Clint Capella, John Collins, or Kevin Huerter, along with the 16th pick. There's been talk that the Jazz want more on top of that, which includes either additional draft capital or Deandre Hunter. Kyler, Landon, as you think about this potential trade between the Jazz and the Hawks, what do you think is actually a fair trade within those parameters that have generally been set?
Firstly, I just want to preface, as you mentioned the report, the guy who reported that deal is almost done is not a very reputable report. So if you're reading this like Rudy Gobert's trade imminent, might need to cool down a little bit, but I do think he's a very likely destination, and I do think John Collins would have to be part of that deal. For the Hawks, it makes sense to try to get, the best defensive player in the league, because you have Trae Young as your star offensive player, and I think they fit pretty well as, your 1 and your 2. I think Clint Capella makes sense just for salary, and you don't need 2 starting centers. And I would just love if we could get DeAndre Hunter in that deal as well. That's kind of as much as John Collins, kind of the guy I want. It just kind of depends on how much of an asset Atlanta views Clint Capella as. If they say no, we think he's a positive value asset and he's not just salary filler, fine, take him out and just include DeAndre Hunter. If he's literally just salary, then I would ask for all 3 of those along with the first round pick. But in terms of that, I don't think there's really much more in terms of picks. I think just 1 pick is good enough for that kind of player return. So I think it's a pretty fair deal, honestly. It gives you wings around Donovan, which I would prefer to build around wings than a center with Donovan. So I think it's pretty good value.
Yeah. I think I agree. The only thing I would say to that is I think any deal that we do here, in my mind, would have to include DeAndre Hunter. I don't want to see this deal go through without him. I think he's exactly the type of player that Jazz need, especially if we're giving up Gobert and we're giving up, our defensive cornerstone. I think it's more important than ever to kind of bolster our perimeter defense. Having a guy like him who's, got that perfect length, that athleticism, something that I think we'll need. He's also, young enough to think he's someone you could build around in the future. So in my mind, like, he's kind of the centerpiece for the Jazz in this trade. So I don't think we do deal without him.
Yeah. I think the DeAndre Hunter aspect of it is a very interesting aspect. He's a former number 4 pick in the draft. He hasn't had as much playing time or maybe shined as brightly as we would have expected him coming out of the draft. But in terms of his body, in terms of his athleticism, in terms of his defense, he's someone who is definitely highly coveted by several teams around the league just because of what he could be, even if he maybe hasn't shown 100% that potential of what he could be. It does make it very interesting, though, because John Collins and Clint Capella are 2 very high quality starters. You have Kevin Huerter, which, by the way, his nickname apparently is Red Velvet, which I think is a top 5 nickname in the league. But Kevin Huerter, a tall white guy who can shoot, that just kind of goes with the Jazz's MO over the past few years of having guys like Joe Ingles and Bojan Bogdanovic. And he's a really quality rotation shooter that I think could be useful for any team. The number 16 overall pick, you could draft a solid player with that. This is a pretty deep draft. Or you could use to package it with another Jazz player to try to get somebody else, which I think is super valuable. But I think the question comes down to, because all the reports that I've read have said that the DeAndre Hunter part of this is what's potentially causing the trade to not go through. And as Kyler mentioned, a lot of the sources we've seen on this aren't the most reputable, but there has been enough buzz to say that there's probably something there, whether everything that's been reported is 100% accurate. So I guess my question for both of you is that if the Jazz were to do this trade without the DeAndre Hunter aspect, would you like it? And would you think that the Jazz made a good trade if we got, let's just say, Capella, Collins in the 16th?
That's it. I'm not as high on that. I think I either need DeAndre Hunter or at least 1 more first for me to like it. Because 16 is not that high. Not saying that their future picks are going to be any higher, but I really like John Collins. He made a big step defensively. Before this year, I would have liked it a lot less than I do now because he was kind of a defensive liability, but he really stepped it up on that end this year because, let's be honest, the Hawks needed defense a lot. And so he's not like this great defender that you want to build a defense around, but he's not like this, Jabari Parker, Civ anymore. So John Collins is a very intriguing player to be the centerpiece, but if he's the centerpiece, I want 2 firsts. So without the second first, I'm thinking it's a solid B- kind of trade to me.
And what would you give it if they had DeAndre Hunter on top of that?
A-. So he's worth 2/3 of a letter grade, I'd say. Or no, a full letter grade is what I gave it. So yeah, full letter grade.
Yeah, and with that, I don't know. I think it depends on what the Jazz kind of want to do, the direction that they're planning to go. Because if you're planning on, doing a quick rebuild and building around these players, I don't think John Collins and Clint Capella move the needle enough to get us to a better spot than where we've been at for the last several years. Obviously, there's that 16th pick involved, which could be something. You never know. But I think you could probably get a better player, a combination of better players if you hold out for Gobert, or if you want to, go full rebuild. I think you could probably get some better draft capital out of him. I'd probably give this, I think, without Deandre Hunter, like a C.
And with Deandre Hunter?
A. I think he's that important of a piece in this whole equation.
Yeah. I mean, as I've looked at this trade possibility in a vacuum, I don't love it. When I compare it to other trades, which we're going to get to in just a minute, I don't know if there's another trade I like better, even if we don't have the DeAndre Hunter aspect, just because I think that the 16th overall pick could be super valuable, not in actually using the pick and taking a player, but in packaging that with like Mike Conley or Royce or somebody else that we could potentially bring into the Jazz's starting lineup. That I think could actually make a bigger difference there. So for me, if the Jazz were to do it without DeAndre Hunter, I'd probably give it a solid B. If we do get DeAndre Hunter or an additional second round pick, like Kyler mentioned, I would give it an A. I don't think we're going to get much better for Gobert.
It's interesting that you'd want to package a pick. That is like something that I am taking off the table for the Jazz. In terms of like the prospect cupboard, ours is practically bare. Like no matter, like I want a first round pick this year. We need to start having developmental players that actually have solid potential on our team, because we're looking very, very bleak in that aspect. So if we get a pick, I want to use it. I don't want to marginally upgrade over Mike Conley or Royce O'Neal with it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it would depend on the type of player that we could get. Because like if we could go out and get like a really, really strong wing, like a good defensive wing, I know that in the past the Jazz were linked to trying to get Jeremy Grant in the past, but if we could do some combination of that 16th pick, Mike Conley, maybe something else on top of that for a Jeremy Grant, I think it could be worth it. Would it maybe make it more difficult to rebuild the team later on by not using the pick? Absolutely. But I think if the Jazz are trading Gobert and keeping Donovan, we are trying to go into a little bit of a win now mode. And I think it makes sense to look at the asset for what it is, an asset, whether that be a player, which I wouldn't be opposed to using the pick either. But I think if the Jazz are going to try to upgrade a player like a Royce or a Mike, we're going to probably have to package a first with it. And that just gives us another option, whether we package that one or one of the Jazz's future firsts, whatever we need to. I think it's good that it just gives us some added flexibility there.
I think I agree with the JR in this one. I think 16th maybe just a little too high to consider like unpackageable in a trade deal. If it was maybe, a little lower, closer to the lottery or in the lottery, then I would probably say hold on to it. But I think the right deal's there. I think I wouldn't have any problem packaging that.
Oh, yeah, I'm not saying unpackageable, but how much of an upgrade is in the 16th pick giving you? I just don't think that's worth like 16 historically. If you look at like what the 16th pick gives you, it's not somebody that's going to really move the needle. Jeremy Grant is nice, but is a Jeremy Grant, Donovan Mitchell, John Collins team a contender? I don't think it is. So I'd rather take a swing at somebody that could be a needle mover in the future.
Yeah. Which there's definitely some needle movers that we could potentially talk about in future episodes if we end up getting some sort of draft pick. I know we all love the draft, and there's definitely some guys that we really like in the late lottery to the early 20s range. But the Atlanta, we'll see what happens there, but it may happen. And depending on if it goes through or not, the Jazz could look very, very differently than they have the past several years with Rudy Gobert. One of the other teams that has been rumored a lot with Jazz is the Toronto Raptors. And this is a pretty simple trade, really centered around two different defensive players. And the trade is simple. Toronto receives Rudy Gobert, and the Jazz receive OG Anunoby and Gary Trent Jr. So no picks involved, just one player for two players. Landon, Kyler. I mean, like really the whole big thing here is that Gary Trent is a decent like rotational guy that you can have. Like teams who have Gary Trent are happy with him. I don't think anybody's really coveting Gary Trent and who he is as a player. So the big idea here is it worth giving up Rudy Gobert's contract? and maybe saving some money there in exchange for a player like OG Anunoby, who also plays a very high level of defense, but plays it in a different position. So as we look at this trade, do you think that trading in a Rudy Gobert anchored defense for an OG Anunoby anchored defense is something the Jazz should consider?
I would say I'd want to pick, like their pick this year is not very good. I can't remember where it is, but I would just want that pick. I don't think that's going to be too much to ask for because it is so late. But I like OG Anunoby more than I like Deandre Hunter. I think he's really good. He's unquestionably the better defender right now. He's one of the better in the league when he's healthy. I also like Gary Trent. I think he's a starting level player. He's not like this incredible starter, but I think he can start for you. I think he's a good backcourt mate to Donovan Mitchell as somebody who can work very well off the ball. So I like this trade, but if it's like pick 25 or whatever they have, I can't remember right now, I would just ask for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think, getting a pick out of this would be great. That'd be awesome. As far as needing it, like that being a deal breaker, I don't think it would be for me. I think the cap space you would save is, that's something to consider. I also really like Gary Trent Jr. and OG Anunoby. I don't think, you swap those out for Gobert. The Jazz are now title contenders. But I do think that is the first of what could be, several moves to help move them to contention. I still think you probably need another, elite level scorer to go along with them on one of the forward spots. But no, I would do this deal because I think Donovan Mitchell and OG Anunoby in a backcourt is good. That's a winning combo in my mind if you can pair them with the right players.
So let's kind of go back and ask them a similar question we did with the last trade. If the Jazz were to do this along with whatever Toronto's pick is, it's a late pick, somewhere in the mid to late 20s. But if they give us OG Anunoby, Gary Trent along with that pick, what grade would you give this trade?
Big old fat A, baby. This is my favorite Rudy Gobert trade partner. Seems like Toronto's kind of cooled off. There's a lot of early reporting, but there's not been a lot of recent reporting on that one. But I'm still hoping it can go through. I think OG Anunoby's the best, young wing defender, 3-and-D kind of guy. I know he doesn't have kind of that wiggle that, you want out of like a secondary scorer, but in terms of an elite perimeter defender as like a tertiary scorer, love that. Gary Trent, I think the 1-2-3 being Donovan, Gary Trent, and OG Anunoby is a really good start. And like Landon said, you just need to make the other moves to kind of solidify your front court after that. But big time dub for me.
Yeah, this is an A for me. If they can swing that, doesn't seem like it's likely, but I think it would work. I think it would work for both teams more than some of the other trades we'll see too. I think Toronto could really benefit from having Gobert there at the center position. So I think win-win. I think it makes the Jazz better. I think that's an A.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this one a lot because as I've talked to other Jazz fans in my life and just talked to them about different trade options, I think I've just come to the conclusion that as much as I like OG Anunoby, I don't think I like him as most as other Jazz fans. And I don't have a great excuse why, other than just I worry about, kind of like Tyler mentioned, his wiggle and his ability to be a guy who can score at a level that we might need to in the playoffs, which makes me a little worried if we're trading Gobert for a player like that who's not going to help us become an elite offense. Somebody who can really like maybe create their own shots or maybe take over like a quarter in a game. So I love OG Anunoby. I like Gary Trent Jr. quite a bit. I just think that if we're going to give up Rudy Gobert, I would want to see more elite offensive talent than maybe elite defensive talent, which I know sound a little bit funny just because we're trading our best defensive player. But if the Jazz are going to rebrand around Donovan Mitchell, I really want to have a team that has another great scorer alongside Donovan Mitchell. And I don't think that Gary Trent or OG really complete that role of being someone who can be a secondary scorer next to Mitchell in a way that's actually going to matter in playoff basketball. So if the Jazz were to do this, I certainly don't hate it because there's things we can do around the edges. See if we can get like another scorer in one of those front court positions that could help Donovan and take some of that scoring load. But if the Jazz went through this trade, I think I'd give it a B, maybe a B plus. But if we're rebuilding around Donovan, I want to see another great offensive player, and I don't think either of them really fit that bill to the way that I would want to.
I question, do you think DeAndre Hunter or John Collins has the wiggle that you're talking about, the ability to make somebody miss? Because I don't see that in them at all either. If I'm being completely honest, I don't think either of them is really a secondary scorer.
I don't think that way about DeAndre Hunter. I think John Collins could. I don't think he's shown it consistently, but I mean, probably the team I watch in my top 3 or 4 teams other than the Jazz, I've watched a lot of Atlanta games. And even though John Collins hasn't always been consistent as an offensive player, I think he is somebody whose offensive ceiling is significantly higher than somebody like an OG Anunoby. Like I can see John Collins as being like the secondary scorer, like a legit secondary scorer next to a Donovan Mitchell, just because he is so athletic and he is big and his shot's getting better all the time. And I think he could be somebody who can not only drive into the paint and score really, really efficiently there, but he's also someone who is getting that 3-point shot efficiency up quite a bit. So even though OG Anunoby is definitely the better defender out of the two, I think just for the team, like the Jazz team that I want to see and what in terms of what their identity is as a team, I think that John Collins fits that mold a little bit better. And on top of that, I like a DeAndre Hunter or a Clint Capella for building like a Jazz team next year than I do a Gary Trent.
It's interesting. Yeah, I guess we just don't see John Collins the same way. I think he depends a lot on a playmaker like Trae Young. He doesn't create for himself as much as you want from your secondary guy, would be my opinion on him.
Yeah, that was the question I was going to ask, because you throw him in a different position. Do you think he'll be able to create his own shot? Because I think that's something that Jazz would need in him, with someone that, you can throw down to when Donovan's doubled or whatever, and you can count on him to, shoot over someone, drive to the lane. Like, can he initiate the offense without being part of a pick and roll or, being a floor spacer and hitting a 3 when the weak side comes in and helps or whatever?
Yeah, which I think those are super fair questions because we haven't seen John Collins become somebody who's done that consistently throughout his career, but I think he's somebody who can get there. But I may be wrong. We'll see what happens. But at least for me, out of those, the two we've talked so far, I would have a slight preference for the Atlanta trade over the Toronto trade. But I think both of them are both in the range of like fair and mutually beneficial for both teams. So I think that there's a reason why a lot of these have rumors is because there's probably at least something to them in terms of the teams talking together. And now moving on to the third team, which hasn't been talked as much about these other two, but the Chicago Bulls. They had what was absolutely a disappointing season after their amazing start. For a good chunk of the early season, they were the number 1 team in the East. They had everything firing on all cylinders. When you had like Lonzo Ball, you had Alex Caruso playing incredible defense. You had Vooch, you had Zach LaVine, you had DeMar DeRozan. And there was a lot of talk even in November and December that the Bulls were like a top 4 title contender team just because they were playing so well. Then they had some injuries. They had some issues with the team in general, that Alex Caruso breaking his arm after the hard foul. Who was the one who fouled him again? I forget who broke his arm. Anyway.
Don't ask me. I don't care.
But ever since the Alex Caruso injury, the team has just gone downhill pretty significantly in terms of how they performed, and they had a very, very disappointing postseason. And as they look to move forward, getting somebody like Rudy Gobert makes a lot of sense for them. Having Vucevic as their center, he is not known for being a defensive center. He's known as more of an offensive center, and having somebody who could play elite defense for them while you have guys like Zach LaVine, like DeMar DeRozan, really just cook and be able to play an elite level of offense, and makes sense for the Bulls as why they would target somebody like Gobert. Now, from the Jazz's perspective, it's wondering what could we get in return from the Bulls that would actually make the Jazz significantly better. The trade that I have seen the most involves several different players and a couple different picks, but here's the one that I've seen most recently. In this case, the Jazz would trade Rudy Gobert, Jordan Clarkson, and a future second-round pick in exchange for Nikola Vucevic, Patrick Williams, Kobe White, and the number 18 pick in this year's draft. That's a lot of moving pieces. The Jazz move their best bench player and arguably one of the best bench ball handlers in the entire league, along with a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year in exchange for Vooch, Patrick Williams, Kobe White, and the pick. After hearing that trade, do you think there's any chance that the Jazz would actually go forward with this?
Oh, you go first, Landon.
I mean, yeah, I think there's a chance. I mean, depends on, what the market really is for Gobert. I mean, as good as he is, I think the reality is, I think you need a system that works for Gobert. He's not someone you can kind of plug into anywhere and he'll fit in, right? So I think that said, I think he's very, very valuable to the teams that could use him, but that's not every team in the league. So I think with that said, I think if Chicago is interested, this is something you have to look at. Yeah, I think I would do this trade. I think I like Kobe White in particular. I think he's someone that I wanted the Jazz as maybe like a backup guard or something. But yeah, I would go for it. I think I would do it.
Well, this one we thoroughly disagree on. I hate this trade so much. I hate every single piece that we're getting here. I do not love an offensive, or shall I say, a defensively deficient player at the most important defensive position in basketball. Hate that. I am fairly low on Patrick Williams. If we're talking about guys who don't have wiggle, I show unto you Patrick Williams. Kobe White, I hate as a fit next to Donovan Mitchell. And the pick's good. So I guess I'm wrong. I don't hate every single piece of this. I like picks. But yeah, not a fan of this at all. I don't like any of the assets. Taking a flyer on Patrick Williams, I don't hate. But in terms of the other young guys that are being talked about, he's easily like a tier below where I would rate DeAndre Hunter and OG Anunoby.
Yeah, I mean, I love getting picks. That's the same way. I loved Patrick Williams coming out of the draft. I still think he's somebody who could be a very, very high-level defender in the league. But coming off that injury where he was sidelined the entire season, I worry that a guy who didn't have a ton of wiggle before, after coming off, I think it was an ACL, is he going to come back and be the same type of defensive prospect that we were hoping for, which makes me worried, even though I love to have him on the team as somebody that I think could become a great player. Kobe White is just kind of like a budget Jordan Clarkson, in my opinion. He's somebody that we can't really play with Donovan. He's not a great defender. He hasn't really shown that he's a great player in this league. And I think that he's just like a bench guard whose job is to come in a few times a year and just score like 8 points in like 5 minutes off the bench when you need him to in a third quarter. And Vooch, I've never been a Vooch guy. I mean, I agree with Kyler. An offensive-minded center who's probably one of the 5 or 6 worst defensive centers who start basketball games regularly is not somebody I want on the team when you have players like Donovan Mitchell. So I hate this trade as well. I would absolutely want somebody like a Zach LaVine if we're going to do a trade with the Bulls, which they're not going to give up by any means. So from that perspective, unless the Jazz go full rebuild and we just take all of the Bulls picks for the next few years, I don't think there's any way that a deal gets done between these two teams.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that you hate it because I know you're higher on Patrick Williams than either of us. We've had talks about he's kind of your guy in terms of defensive forwards. He's been your favorite. That's what you've told us in conversations. So it's interesting to me that you like this one less than the other two.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree, but just from our conversations, I wouldn't expect that from you.
See, I love Patrick Williams. I love him as a prospect, and I still think he could be a really, really great player in this league. I've said before in one of my hot take moments that I think Patrick Williams has a very good shot at being a future all-defensive player in this league.
Multiple time, not just one time. You said
It was all NBA at first. Don't forget that.
You also said all NBA first, which had me and Landon cackling.
When I said all NBA, that was a mistake. I meant to say all defense, and I still think he could be somebody who can make multiple second-team all-defenses or even a first-team all-defensive team. I think he could be that good as a defender in this league. That being said, he's coming off of an ACL. And as good as he was in his rookie season, he doesn't have the same consistency to trade for somebody like a Rudy Gobert, who has shown for the past, I think he's now a 6-time first team all defensive player in Rudy Gobert. And you don't trade somebody who you know what you're going to get defensively for someone who's shown a lot of flashes, who could be really good, but hasn't really proven it and hasn't proven that they can do it coming off of a very significant injury. So for that case, I love Patrick Williams. If the Jazz could figure out a trade to get Patrick Williams and trading like other assets, I'd be totally down. But I don't think he's worth anywhere near someone like a Rudy Gobert or Donovan Mitchell is at this point. But I still do love Patrick Williams. I stick by my statement saying that he could be multiple-time all-defensive player, but he hasn't proven that yet. And I'm never going to trade, just a future maybe for a very consistent, this is what I do on the court, which is what Rudy Gobert gives any team.
Yeah. Let me see if I can defend this trade a little bit more. I think part of my reasoning for kind of liking it was I think when you trade a player like Gobert, I think the best you could possibly hope to get out of that would be a starter, a prospect, and a first-round pick. I think that this deal satisfies that criteria. And I do kind of like Patrick Williams' potential, kind of definitely more on the defensive end than the offensive end. And obviously, swapping Gobert for Vucevic is total 180. But I think if you have someone like Patrick Williams, maybe some other good defenders on the team, I think that makes up for it. And on top of that, I think if we're not able to kind of bolster our defense on the perimeter and teams decide to go small on us again, spread the floor out and just kind of, eat our guards for lunch. We now have a counter to that in Vucevic, right? Like you try to go small on him. He's a guy you can dump the ball to. He's got some good post moves. You can probably score on him. So I think he provides an interesting counter if teams try to beat us the way that they beat us in the past. And I think Kobe White adds some depth. I think he's a backup point guard. I think he's a career backup point guard. But I think that's something that the Jazz could need, and especially a young one like that you could, hopefully develop and turn into someone who could be more efficient, even if he's lacking defensively. I think he gives them depth that I don't think they had before.
After how you talked about Jared Butler last episode, I'm surprised you think we could need a backup point guard. I don't know. I think the one thing that was mentioned by J. Balbe as maybe a deterrent for Patrick Williams is the ACL. I think ACLs are a little bit more, they've become like overrated as an injury. If you look at the last 5 years, especially in young players, it's like not a kind of career deterrent as they used to be. Modern medicine has kind of made most injuries except for like maybe Achilles and like broken tibias and stuff like that. Like those are the kind of things that still degrade your career. But if you're a young player and you're not like Joe Ingles, who was already, in the second percentile in speed before, you have an injury like that, most players come back 100%, and some even say they feel stronger. And so I don't know if I would, unless there's like a deep injury history, which if we get to the draft, we might talk about. Unless there's a consistent injury history, I don't think a single ACL injury is nearly the deterrent that it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting. This one definitely has the most change for the Jazz's roster. But I think just when it comes down to it, if we're going to have a trade with Rudy Gobert, would I rather have the centerpiece be OG Anunoby? Would I rather have it be John Collins? Or would I rather have it be Vooch and a prospect? And I think just for right now where the Jazz are building, Vooch is like the least centerpiece player that I would want.
Well, I think the centerpiece would be considered Patrick Williams. I don't think it's considered Vooch.
Yeah.
I think both the Bulls and the Jazz consider Patrick Williams the more valuable asset. So I think he's considered the centerpiece more than Vucevic would be.
But if we bring in Vucevic, he has to be our starting center, which is tough. Which I don't
want to root for that guy.
Yeah, which I just remember that hard foul he had on Royce O'Neal a few years ago that we talked about in the last episode, and haven't liked him since. So sorry, Vooch. I respect your game, but don't love you as a player. All right, so real quick lightning round. Let's just say that you're Ryan Smith, the Jazz GM, everyone all in one. And right now you have all three of these trades on the table, and you have the option to keep Rudy Gobert and see what could potentially happen with him over the next few days. But you have to make a decision. Are you taking one of these three trades, or are you going to wait it out and keep him? What would you do?
I would hang up on Chicago, and I would tell Atlanta and Toronto that I wanted the pieces that I said before. I want Deandre Hunter in the case of Atlanta, or I'd want the 20 whatever pick from Toronto. If either of them budge on that, I would accept Toronto's first, Atlanta's second. If not, I'm keeping Rudy Gobert.
Landon?
Yeah, I had to choose. Gonna gets my head. I'll do Toronto with that pick. If the pick's not there, then I'm doing Chicago. If DeAndre Hunter is part of that Atlanta deal, then I'm doing it. Otherwise, I'm not. I'm not even considering it.
Yeah. So you would do the Chicago deal as is?
Yes, I would.
Cool. Yeah. Just wanted to clarify.
I still like the Atlanta deal the most. I would have my rankings be Atlanta with DeAndre Hunter as first, then probably the OG Anunoby trade with the 25th pick as second, and then just the Atlanta trade without DeAndre Hunter as my third option, just because I think I'm a lot higher on John Collins than most people. I think Clint Capella gives us 85% of what Rudy Gobert does on the defensive end of the court. And
85 is high.
I don't know if it's that high.
3-time defensive player of the year compared to Clint Capella?
I don't think it's that far off. I really don't.
That's ludicrous, but continue on.
Yeah, so that's what I would do. I try to see if I can make that deal with Atlanta work around DeAndre Hunter, and then if not, I would finagle with Toronto. And
I want to encourage you to watch more Rudy Gobert. If you think Clint Capella is 85% of him, that's crazy.
No, I like Clint Capella. I think he's really good. All right,
he's good. He's not 85% of a 3-time defensive player of the year.
All right. Well, that'll do it all for this episode. It's going to be a fun week. We got the NBA draft coming up. We just had the finals end with the Golden State Warriors as a championship team. So we are now officially deep into the offseason, and we'll see if the Jazz start making trades. And hopefully we like what they end up doing with their team a lot better than what we liked, than what they ended up doing with their rebrand. So thanks again for tuning into another episode of the Upper Bowl Perspective. I'm JR, as always, with Kyler and Landon, and we'll see you next week.
Ciao, ciao.